Laura and I have 3 daughters, and they are all college age, and we have been thrilled at that. And so growing up in a home with a wife and 3 daughters, it's a thrill for me tonight to get to hear my own voice. And so thank you for asking me to come. And I didn't know until I got here that this is being beamed via the TV camera back there. This is being beamed apparently around the world right now, or at least into the other room that's in there. So welcome to all of you in the other room. And we do have extra desserts in here if y'all didn't get any, so just walk on over. You know, on the back of your program, it talks about the President's Club, and this is your 50th anniversary. Y'all were formed by the Board of Trustees in 1968. I looked back to see what the report was when they were formed, and it said that there were 3 stated aims. I noticed on the program on the back you've just given one of them. So being a teacher, I would like to grade you on your objectives. The first one said that you should offer assistance to the president. And when we came in, I noticed someone helping Eric up the stairs, so that one is a check mark. Second one was to hold meetings and discuss objectives. That's about the most generic aim I've ever heard, but we are holding a meeting and we are discussing an objective of eating, I think. The third one was to give gifts to aid the university. Now, I'm not sure what all that means when it says gifts. I don't know if cologne, an extra white horse, something like that. But I'm going to give you an A on that one too. So your very first get-together, though, wasn't in 1968. It was in April of 1970. It was last Friday. It was April the 13th. There were 45 members who gathered in the school cafeteria. And as they were meeting and enjoying the first meeting, overhead, 205,000 miles overhead at that very moment, Jack Swigert flipped a switch, and Apollo 13 had a crisis set in motion while they were meeting. Back here on Earth, your predecessors, though, were setting this very noble cause in motion, which, of course, is still thriving today. So in attendance for that first inaugural meeting were the then current and several former presidents. Dr. Skiles, of course, was the president at the time, but also Dr. White, Dr. Richardson, Dr. Landis, and Dr. Graham were all in attendance. Dr. Richardson was still teaching history out at Hardin-Simmons. Dr. White had moved on, and he was the chancellor at Baylor University. Dr. Landis was then the pastor at First Baptist Church in Richardson, and Dr. Graham was teaching at Appalachian State. Dr. Richardson told that very first group, and I think Dr. Skiles and Dr. Fletcher, and I'll speak for Dr. Hall and Dr. Bruntmeyer, I think they would echo what he said. Dr. Richardson said that the interest that you manifest is encouraging. Doesn't that sound like Dr. Richardson using big words? I would say thanks for the pat on the back, but he was much better with words. I thought tonight, though, we would just take a look back at some common HSU history since we're all familiar with it. We're just going to pretend like we're sitting around the kitchen table with the family scrapbook, and we'll just wipe the dust from some faded photographs and stir up some memories. In our album, we'll find this, and if you can't see the screen, you might want to turn because you'd rather see that than looking up here at me the whole time. But this is from April of 1891. It says, work on the Baptist College was begun in earnest yesterday morning, and the excavations for the foundation will be completed this week. Well, like most construction timeline estimates, no offense intended, Mr. Crow, those construction timelines, they're usually off a little because that one was a little overambitious because 127 years later, work still continues in earnest, and the foundation of this Baptist College remains a work in progress every week, every semester, every year. Dr. Richardson had reminded them at that very first club that change is a cardinal principle of life, and institutions that don't change don't live. And I would say amen to that. And so we continue to change and evolve. Below this article, I noticed it had this. It said, an observant citizen who recently settled near Abilene remarked a few days ago that he had seen less drunkenness in Abilene than in any place he ever visited. That the morals of the people were generally much better than he had expected to find. So that's nice to exceed expectations and not to cast civic aspersions, but that observant citizen had moved to Abilene from Waco. So Fairly regularly, Laura and I drive through the campus and we let the memories wash over us and admire how nice things look. And today all of us can enjoy how nice things look out there due to some long ago decisions. If you dust off one picture, you're going to see Mrs. Sandifer. Lucille Sandifer, of course, was the wife of President Sandifer, and she was constantly looking for ways to beautify the school. And just 1 year after she arrived in 1909, she saw to it that the pecan saplings were planted out there near the founders' graves, and those century-old trees still cool that spot and still give a leafy cast to the 7 souls who are buried there. 127 years makes our school, the very idea, a very old Baptist tradition. Certainly not the oldest Baptist tradition, because I think predating even Hardin-Simmons is the long-held Baptist tradition of denominationally induced guilt over ordering wine in public. So, like every devoted Baptist, I order it in a coffee cup, assuming the waiter is not a member of my church. Certainly the charter for Hardin-Simmons goes back a long ways, and it got me to wondering if it was the oldest thing at the school. And this is where a really clever speaker always says, no, the oldest thing at the school is so-and-so professor. But I'm not that clever, and they can still go back and change your grade, and so I'm going to leave that one out. So what is old around our campus? Well, my list came up with these things. We have Mrs. Sandifer's really old pecan trees. We have an old bell. We still have an old relic of that very first building, and we even have that tiny cemetery with some very old headstones in it. But after a lot of thought, I finally concluded that surely the oldest thing out there is that petrified tree in front of Abilene Hall, because it is hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of years old, and it has stood on campus for nearly 100 years, 99 to be exact. It was hauled there by Rice Pearson and D.Q. Riddle, who were the ringleaders of the class of 1919, and they dug that fossilized tree trunk out of the creek bank on a farm belonging to Dr. J.M. Estes south of Clyde, and they lugged it to campus, and it was mounted on a concrete base in front of the original Abilene Hall. It has been there a long time. If that tree could talk, we would really have something if that tree could talk. It would certainly tell some tales, because for many years, that tree was the place for pitching woo. Many a boy has made a fool of himself next to that tree while the girls batted their eyes. I think today, for those students who are in the room, you can forget Match.com. Go stand by the petrified tree if you'd like to get a date. When I enrolled at Hardin-Simmons, the ground was being torn up, excavated, and things were certainly changing. Then, when you walked out of the north door of Nix Hall, you ran right into heavy equipment that was digging the foundation for maybe gym. This picture shows where the gym is. Of course, that's the old Rose Fieldhouse there. And where the Johnson building now stands, there was equipment that was knocking down Mary Frances Hall, but if you might recall, it didn't take much to push her over. She was pretty wobbly at that point. And at the school's entrance, the parking lot was being ripped up, and a bulldozer was scooping out the reflecting pond there in its place. But interestingly, it was while they were excavating for the gym that the long buried remains of poor old Billy Cowden were uncovered. And that was a real shock, because no one even knew that the remains were resting there. Billy Cowden was tall. He was 3 stories tall. He was made of brick. He was the boys' dorm. And although there certainly was a real Billy Cowden, he was reverently buried somewhere else, not under the gym. But as the workers scraped away the old Rose Fieldhouse and bulldozers began digging the foundation for the gym, they uncovered the floor in the basement of the 1907 built Cowden Hall, which was lined with those red Thurber bricks. When Dr. and Mrs. Sandifer arrived here in 1909, that is where they first had a room, was in Billy Cowden Hall. Rupert Richardson roomed there, and he said that he could tell you many tales of the fire-trappy place full of wooden stairs and floors. At one point, the boys of Cowden Hall formed a club. It was called the Banana Split Club. You can't see all of the officers, but one of them was a scout and another one was a deacon. Any club that has a scout and a deacon for an officer is a club I'm interested in joining. The club had caught wind of the janitor, who had been part 1 of a 2-part affair, and this was a shared secret amongst the boys of Billy Cowden and the janitor. And so in return for their silence, the janitor was obligated to supply banana splits all around when they reminded him of that, which was it was an extortive arrangement, but it was a tasty arrangement too. And it was working fine until one Sunday afternoon in 1922 when Billy Cowden's creaky old wooden stairs and hallways lived up to their reputation. And as you can see, it all burned very nicely. The remains, though, were scraped away, and the basement was filled in and covered over. I don't believe the janitor was involved, but they said he was standing off to the side, grinning like the Cheshire Cat over there. But it was the remains of this one-time dorm that were being uncovered in 1978 as I walked into that bit of my personal history. I didn't really know it then. I don't think I recognized it then, but I do now, that for an idea to endure, to be well grounded, certainly to endure for 127 years, every so often things have to be torn up, things have to be excavated, and they have to be changed a bit. In fact, the theme for the 75th anniversary back in 1966 for the Hardin-Simmons was the university in midst of change. I think Dr. Richardson knew it, and he understood that institutions that don't change don't live. Well, look underfoot the next time that you walk in front of the library, and you'll be walking on a bit of old Billy Cowden, because some of those uncovered red Thurber bricks were nostalgically incorporated by Don Bridges into the sidewalks over there. 6 weeks before classes got started out there, for the very first time, the Taylor County News newspaper sponsored a contest to find the most popular girl in Taylor County. The grand prize was she would get a full scholarship to attend the brand new, soon to open, Simmons College. And so they kept daily tallies in the paper. And right out of the gate, Miss Mamie Douglas and Miss Hinda Berry were neck and neck in the voting. In addition to the scholarship, though, local businesses tossed in some extra prizes: a studio portrait, a dress pattern from the milliner. The feed store offered up a dictionary. The shoe store offered whoever won first place would get a pair of patent leather shoes. Radford Grocery pledged the winner would get a semester's worth of chewing gum. In a show of support and to soothe possible wounded pride, Riston Grocery promised a gold ring to whichever girl came in third. So, as the young fillies made the turn at the top of the home stretch, Mamie Douglas pulled away from the field with 5,300 votes as the most popular girl in Taylor County. Second place went to another Mamie Badger, who, after the announcement was made that she was second place, she reportedly was laid up in bed with a slow fever. Actually, she just didn't want to see Mamie Douglas prancing around in those shiny new patent leather shoes. But in the end, it was decided to give scholarships to the top three girls. And so the real winner was third place Hinda Berry, who not only got free tuition, but she got the gold ring to boot. But when the school opened on September the 13th of 1892, the initial enrollment stood at 89. There were 48 boys, 41 girls, 3 of those girls on a free ride. And all but 2 of the students were from Texas. 75 of the 89 were from Abilene. Tuition for the 10-month term was $180. I'm sure they tacked on fees, though, as they always do, parking your horse, technology fee for using their rulers and those kinds of things. And student expectations were set out in the handbook. It said that no boy could be out of his room after 8 p.m. Aimless loitering about town was highly discouraged, and male students were not allowed to visit or escort the ladies, which caused many male students to wonder why they had enrolled in college in the first place. The sole building on campus, Old Main, stood in front of where the science building stands today. And of course, it was the cost of completing this original building which prompted the Abilene Baptist College to become Simmons College in honor of those who supplied the funds. Old Main's cornerstone, which was not even close to being at the corner of the building, was located on the second floor between the 2 windows that you see there, and it was set in place on July the 4th, 1891. It was a Masonic ceremony led by General John Sayles. In fact, it was John Sayles' son, Henry, who had first suggested the very idea of a Baptist college here in town. The ceremony for the cornerstone laying was a day-long event. It started with a parade here in downtown. It ended with speeches out at the school, and they had a barbecue just about where Barron's Auditorium is, where they fed 6,000 pounds of meat. The newspaper reported that throughout the hours of the celebration, quote, "the very best order was observed and not a drunk man was seen on the school grounds." So I think they had their wine in their coffee cups, but I like the way my English professor put it. Dr. Bob Fink wrote this: July 4th, 1891, its cornerstone laid to hold, through storms of sand, scrub mesquite, and prickly pear, coyotes and diamondbacks. Well, Old Main was vastly remodeled in 1919 and repurposed into the Simmons Science Building. And the original cornerstone was removed up there from its perch, and they set it aside so that they could reset it into the actual corner of the building. And when that time came, they started looking around for it, and no one seemed to be able to find it. You think we could keep up with a 400-pound slab of rock, but it was gone, and its location remained a mystery for the next 31 years. As the school got going, the campus was described in print this way: a beautiful college surrounded on all sides by trees, grass-covered plains, and hills. As you can tell, we had a very good PR man on staff there. 1891 turned out to be a terrible time to start a college. Abilene was tiny. It was barely 10 years old. There were more prairie dogs than people. In the first 10 years, we ran through 5 presidents at the school, and before this little sapling school could even take root, the economic panic of 1893 occurred, which until the Great Depression was by far the worst depression we'd had in this country. But that young school did hang on, and mostly it was due to the devotion of some local families who wanted to build a school for their kids and who wanted to advance the future of their town. 5 members of that inaugural student group were the children of the president. This is the school's first president, Dr. Friley. He was just a short-termer. He was only here for about 2 years. Our second president, George Thatcher, he and his wife only had 2 children, but they enrolled them. And Dr. Thatcher had actually been a professor at the school under Dr. Friley. He taught Greek, Latin, and math. And I know exactly what you're thinking, and it is uncanny, I'll say that. The third man on the scene was Dr. Owen Pope, and he was a feisty rascal if there ever was one. He was preaching one Sunday at the First Baptist Church here, and Dr. Pope got to pounding and yelling and became so enraptured in his sermon that his upper dentures came flying out and they clattered onto the communion table below. And yet boldly and with drawn lip, he soldiered on, speaking to a congregation that I'm sure was not hearing a single word he said at that point. He is also the reason we have one of our campus antiques. Dr. Pope was on a train headed to Abilene when he began to tell his seatmate that the school needed a bell. Of course, a bell was a dire necessity. It told you when to wake up, when to eat, when to go to class. It was like our phones beep and buzz to tell us what to do. The bell was, of course, the heartbeat of the campus. A man sitting behind Dr. Pope on the train leaned up and he asked how much a new bell would cost, and he was told probably around $500. A few minutes later, that man, who was George Bennett, the founder of Acme Brick, he leaned forward again, and this time he handed Dr. Pope a check for $500, telling him to go to the store and get a bell. So that bell was ordered from Mr. Paxton's hardware store here in Abilene, and when it arrived, Dr. Pope went down to pick it up. And he asked Mr. Paxton for a receipt so that he could show Mr. Bennett that the school had not made any money on the transaction. And Mr. Paxton was greatly offended, and he threatened to slap President Pope, who proceeded to take off his coat and said, "Let's take it outside." Thankfully, the tempers cooled. In fact, they cooled so much that Mr. Paxton would later be a trustee of the school. And when new Cowden Hall was built in 1941, it was with the help of a donation from Paxton's children, and thus the combined name of Cowden-Paxton Hall. Well, for 2 decades, Dr. Pope's 700-pound bell was rung several times each day, striking the music and calling the students out there to the rhythms of the life at Hardin-Simmons. And it was again Mrs. Sandifer who had the idea in the 1940s to set that old bell up in a prominent place and to have a brick monument built to hold it in its place of honor. So for nearly 75 years, it has hung in the shade of the pecan trees as a silent echo to the school. For me, and I suspect for most of you in this room, there is a fair bit of happiness and fragrance and sunshine associated with Hardin-Simmons. At least I hope so. And one kismet of blessing for me has certainly been that it was the common denominator that brought me and my wife together. Because had she not had that school to choose from, I'm not sure she would have ever chosen me. And now, some 30 years later, we share a full life that is richly blessed. So this university, which was the result of a series of events, that line of events helped shape my life as it has helped shape your life. In fact, it's what puts us together in this room tonight. Lots of institutions are conceived and born into existence. Some last 127 years and much longer. Some, though, as the wind passes over and they are known no more. The difference to me seems to be that for those survivors, along the way, other people buy into and stand behind the same idea. And Abilene Baptist College may have been born legally 127 years past, but it was been subscribed to along the way by lots of folks. And if we hadn't had couples like, for instance, KK and Laura Leggett, James and Mary Paramore, or Clabe and Francis Merchant, I'm not sure what would have happened if they had not bought into this idea, or if the Cowdens and the Hollises and Mr. and Mrs. George Paxton had not stood behind this idea and had not written checks, and had men like Julius Olson and Oscar Henry Cooper and a host of others. If they had only made it a brief stop, what if they had not moved this idea of Hardin-Simmons along? Well, here they stand on the wooden steps of Billy Cowden Hall at its dedication in 1908. I suspect many of you know how Hardin-Simmons got started. It's a story that's been told many times. And of course, every institution really is just the lengthened shadow of one man or one woman, one expressed idea. And the first person who expressed it for the school to be brought, as I mentioned earlier, was Mr. Henry Sales. He was a 38-year-old local attorney, and he suggested the idea of a college. And he was not Baptist, but he knew that the Baptists had the strength of numbers in Abilene, so he suggested to them that they might want to consider starting it for the city. And that very first step happened just a few months later, when in August of 1890, over in Sweetwater, the area Baptist had heard a proposition from KK Leggett, Mr. Sales' good friend. Leggett would go on to serve as the school's president for a number of years. At the Sweetwater Association, they approved the idea, and then they appointed a 7-man committee to find a suitable site for the school. And Sweetwater, Anston, and Colorado City were all pushing for it, as was Abilene. Most of the committee, though, was from Abilene, and so they seemed to push our direction, and in the end, we got the nod. The land, of course, was in the North Park addition, 2 miles at that time north of downtown Abilene. The 16 acres were donated by 3 men who were developing the area, Mr. George Phillips of Abilene and 2 other men from Fort Worth, Mr. Theodore Vogel and Mr. Emery Amble, whose streets we drive along today. 6 members of the locating committee would gather in the office of Dr. Smith, who was the pastor of First Baptist Church. 127 years ago, they met on a Wednesday afternoon before they had prayer meeting that night. And at the meeting, the school charter was presented. Judge Leggett read the 6 articles to the group that was assembled. Among many facts, one of them was that they named the 15 trustees to ensure the future success of the school. The language of the charter was not romantic. Article 1 rather succinctly states that this association shall be known as the Abilene Baptist College, by which name it shall contract and be contracted with, sue and be sued, and transact all its business. I don't know why we wanted to have everyone to know how to properly sue us, but we put that in there too. At that same meeting, plans were presented by Mr. Archer, an architect and builder for the proposed building. And so while the charter is not as old as the old petrified tree out there, it's certainly one of the oldest physical relics of this idea. And right on the hills of it came this building. The trustees opted to face the building to the south towards the people of Abilene. And 4 months after the charter, that lone college building sat partially finished while the school's bank account sat totally finished. A life-breathing, school-saving gift, though, was secured from the First Baptist Church pastor and his wife, James and Mary Simmons. I mean the First Fifth Avenue Baptist, not First, Fifth Avenue Baptist in New York City. And it would be their gift that would finish the school, and prompting the trustees, of course, to rename the school. I've thought about that often, that here's this couple in New York City in 1891. At the time, they were in their mid-60s. They probably sat down with their son, Robert, who was in his 40s, probably in the parlor of their home, which was on East 59th Street, 3 blocks east of Central Park, and probably around their dining table, I would assume. And the Simmons must have talked about this tiny school, this tiny idea in Abilene, Texas, and they came to the decision that they would write a check to an idea that had been hatched 1,500 miles away. And so they had no idea if the school would even make it. They didn't know what the prospects were, but they wrote a check to excavate and to pour a foundation and to grow an institution that has echoed to the point that we are in this room tonight and that we recall their lives. That family decision made it probable, if not altogether possible, that I met my wife, that I'm raising 3 daughters, to enjoy a life associated with this school and with you people. It made it possible for you to be here tonight and to rub shoulders with the people who are seated at your table, to be a part of this noble cause and to lay some foundations for some students out there who have not yet even been born. Well, the Simmons not only wrote a check, but when this school was seriously teetering on the verge of the wind blowing it over just 10 years into its existence, it was Dr. Simmons who demonstrated what I think is the ultimate show of confidence in the place. He directed that the remains of his deceased wife be disinterred from her burial spot in the family plot in Rhode Island, and that it be transported to a place that she had never seen in life and that she had never been to, and that she be reburied in the heart of this campus in 1901. And that act of devotion alone seemed to reinvigorate those who were trying to push this faltering idea along. Dr. Simmons, of course, made arrangements that upon his death, he too would be buried very, very far away from his home in New York City. And I think that is a rare thing indeed. I think Mrs. Sandifer fully understood the enormity of that gesture. That is a great reason to forever shade a grave. The 1891 gift of James and Mary Simmons had been made, of course, in time to chisel Simmons College into that cornerstone before it was set amid that scrub mesquite and prickly pear. It was in 1951, 31 years after the cornerstone went missing, that Dr. Rupert Richardson got a call from Mr. T.J. Bauer, who was a telephone repairman on a job in East Abilene. Mr. Bauer was at the Howard residence at 934 Plum, troubleshooting their phone line, when he noticed their back porch step. The Howards said it was there when they had moved in a few years before, and they were glad to see it return to the school, but that they were going to miss it because it was the perfect place for cracking pecans and scraping the mud off of your shoes. So after 3 decades, the cornerstone came back north to its home, and we promptly put it in a glass case, and we have vowed to keep an eye on it ever since. It's over there in Moody Center, and many of you walk by it regularly. So, marking 127 years digging that foundation, one that has certainly helped define each of us. An excavation dug into 16 acres, into those 40 acres, into Hardin-Simmons University, a fair daughter and a noble cause. I look around this room and I know that many of you attended Hardin-Simmons, many of you graduated there, some of you work there, some of you taught there or still teach there, some of you serve on boards that you've been asked to. Maybe you're one of those who receives a check from there, or maybe you're one who writes a check to there. Maybe you met your spouse there, you met your career there, you met your dream there. The ground has been torn up there. That mesquite and prickly pear has given way there. The graves were dug, trees have been planted, a bell has tolled, and certainly change has occurred so that we could be here in this room tonight. An idea conceived in an age long before ours and purchased wholly into by couples like the Leggetts and the Paramores and the Merchants and people like George and Minnie Anderson and John and Mary Hardin. All of those I consider foundation people. The Cowdens and the Compiers, Oscar Cooper, Julius Olson, Lawrence Clayton, old Doc Beasley, Don Bridges, Mrs. Logsdon, the Nix family. I could keep going. James Cram, Lee Hemphill, Dr. Lloyd Huff, Prexies like Sandifer and Richardson and Skiles, Otho Polk, Dr. Jack Dean, and lots of supporters like Hook and Eddie Davis, the Jennings, the Burrows, the Hollands, the Caldwells, Dr. Virginia Conley, Jess and Dot Fletcher, Laney and Carol Hall, Eric and Elise Bruntmeyer, and you, and those who are seated at the table with you tonight. A host of names that have been writ large out there along Mr. Ambler's Avenue, that red bricked lexicon of Hardin-Simmons. You know, to walk around Hardin-Simmons is to be reminded. When you walk through Moody Center and you see that relic, that physical reminder of a long ago idea that is piercing through the decades all the way into today and to someone else's tomorrow. I hope you're reminded as you see that old bell still there, still aloft, a past heartbeat, the music of the school, and a heartbeat that is still beating. Reminded as you pass that tiny graveyard shaded by those stately pecan trees, just how perfect it is that in the center of our campus today are the old graves of James and Mary Simmons and their son Robert, who sat down in their New York home and decided that yes, they would write a check, they would put it in an envelope, they would seal it, they would stamp it, and they would mail it off into our future. How perfect that those trees that she planted shade not only the grave of her husband, but they shade her own grave as well, and they shade the days that we spend here. They remind us to think of those future generations. And you too are part of Hardin-Simmons. Part of you has to be buried there as surely as old Billy Cowden was buried there. And part of you will always be a part of the foundation of what we call the fair daughter of the West. So I say long live, long live, long live this noble cause of the West. Thank you all very much.